I want to start this week by saying something about your first papers. The papers were okay. I did grade rather leniently, so make sure you look at your comments. You'll have to go to Turnitin to find the comments. They're written right on your paper. Read the email I sent out. In general, what you want to do with a philosophy paper is say only true things. Say only true things that are doing work for your paper, not merely true things. And say all the true things that you need to exhaust the topic. So this paper you could divide up into a number of distinct tasks. And I want to run through what would be a full credit paper here rather than typing it up to give you some idea of what you could do and it'd be sufficient and exemplary. So you would start with the introductory paragraph, explain what you're going to do. I wrote that for you. The only thing you had to do was fill out which of the various other theories you were going to talk about. But then in that next paragraph, you would say something like, substance dualism says that there are two different kinds of substances, the mental and the physical. Mind and body are of different substances. Mind is of the mental substance, body is of the physical substance. Mind and body have different essential properties. The mind is thinking, unextended, immaterial. The body is non-thinking, extended, material. And there you go, you're done with the first paragraph. Second paragraph would say, but it seems intuitive that there is causal interaction. The mind causes changes in body causes changes in mind. But if, as the substance dualist defines mind and body, they're distinct substances, it doesn't seem that this causal interaction can occur. It doesn't seem that an unextended thing could cause a change in an extended thing, that an immaterial thing could cause a change in a material thing, and vice versa. Since causal interaction seems to be actual, this is a real problem for substance dualism. Done with the next paragraph. Then you say there have been other theories devised to account for this causal interaction problem. Say, type identity theory is one such theory. Type identity theory says that all mental types are identical to some physical type, particularly some physical type of brain and nervous system state. Since type identity theory defines the mental as a proper subset of the physical, mind-body interaction is just body-body interaction. It is physical-physical interaction. Physics gives us a good understanding of how physical-physical interaction occurs, how an extended thing affects another extended thing, how a material thing affects another material thing. So the causal identity, the type identity theory does not have the same problem. It gets around the causal interaction problem. Done with that paragraph. Next paragraph, but type identity theory takes on its own problems. Then you have some options here. You could talk about a number of different things. Say you talk about the issue of qualia. One thing that's supposed to be a problem for type identity theory is that there do seem to be some properties true of the mental, not true of the physical. If the mental has some property the physical does not have, the mental and the physical cannot be identical. One such property is the qualitative aspects of mental experience. It seems that there is something it's like to have a mental experience, and it does not seem this is a property had by the physical. So there seems to be a problem in identity theory. You're basically done at that point. You could say something about, but this problem seems to not be as severe as the causal interaction problem. Maybe there's some way type identity theory could explain this. Nonetheless, type identity theory does not face the causal interaction problem. If you say those things, you've said nothing false, you've said only true things, you've said only true things that are doing work in the paper, and you've said everything you need to say. That would be a full credit paper once I fill in the conclusion. The only other thing I might want to put in there are examples to help clarity of what I mean by mental physical causation. An itch causes me to scratch. Say, the mental experience of an itch causes a movement of my hand. The movement of my hand moving across my skin causes a different mental experience, the cessation of the original itch. Something like that. Those examples, if you did a good job with everything else, are gratuitous. You don't need them in there. Right? Think about that. Think about how the paper I just outlined and actually gave you in its entirety. If you did that, that would be a three-page paper. No problem. That does everything you need it to do. Does not do anything you don't need it to do. That would be a full credit paper. I defined everything I needed to define. I treated all the concepts. I connected them in a logical way. Done. Full credit. Another issue that I want to treat that came up in a number of the papers was this idea that what we have in these different theories of the nature of the mind are just different approaches or different opinions. This absolutely is not the case. Our theories of the nature of mind, and now our theories of mental content, are developed to account for issues, problems, to give explanations, allow for predictions. And the theories of mind, the theories in philosophy, progress just as scientific theories do. I'm going to say, though there's an entire theory that backs this up, that philosophy progresses scientifically. I started to say quasi-scientifically, but I don't want to leave any room for you to think that there are matters of opinion here. There are matters of opinion as to which theory better accounts, but theories progress and are presented to solve problems with other theories. If a theory is inconsistent, then that's the reason we would put another theory in its place. If a theory has a counterintuitive implication, that's a reason to look for another theory to solve this issue. If a theory can't explain everything we want it to, like causal interaction, if it can't allow us to predict, then we might get another theory to solve these problems, and we progress from theory to theory based on very rigorous criteria. These criteria are the criteria of the method of science. It does not utilize all of the scientific methods. Nonetheless, we progress from theory to theory based on very rigorous considerations. And we see that this week very explicitly in both the Fodor and the Dennett, where they talk about theories, connect them to science, explain, well, this theory is here because it explains something another theory didn't. There's a problem with this theory. For that, we might progress to a different theory. That's the way we think. I'm going to lay out a sort of framework to understand this week's readings. This is sort of what I've been doing. Looking at the readings, you might think, well, this is about language, it's about words, it's about philosophy of language. It's not clear how it's about philosophy of mind. I want to give you a framework for understanding what's going on. These lectures are supposed to give you a framework to better understand the readings and connect them to other readings. The lectures are not supposed to take the place of the readings. In order to understand everything fully, you're going to have to go to the readings and try your best to understand them. They're difficult. Hopefully, with the framework from the lecture, the readings are more accessible. So this is our second section. We're moving from theories of the nature of mind to theories of mental content. Now, we saw early on that in response to identity theory, there was supposedly a property of the mental not had by the physical that challenged identity theory. And the first such property we saw was intentionality, the aboutness. Mental properties are about something in the world. I have a thought of something. I poke myself in the foot with a pen. My thought is about the pain in my foot. And it seems, so it's claimed, that, well, this intentionality is had by mental properties and not by physical properties, so the mental and the physical can't be identical. Now we're concerned narrowly with this intentionality. If mental properties, if thoughts are about something, how is it that they're about something? And if we can get a handle on that, then we can more directly evaluate this issue, this claim that there is an intentional property had by the mental, not had by the physical. It was said that, well, mental properties have an intentionality, they're about something, physical properties don't. Well, until we make clear how anything can be about something else, we can't evaluate whether it's true that, one, mental properties are about something, and two, Physical properties are not about something. Now, it does seem clear that mental properties are about something. We have thoughts about things. And now we need to have some way to account for a physical property if we're going to give an identity theorist account, even a functionalist account, any sort of reductionist account that reduces the mental to the physical. We need to have some explanation of how physical or functional properties can be about things in the world. And so first, again, I've said this before, but we need to be clear that here we're talking about intentionality with a T. Thoughts are about something. They're intentional with a T. This is different than being intentional with an S. To say that a thought or a sentence or a word is intentional is to say that it has a sense, concepts associated with it, ways of thinking about it. And the meaning of a term or a sentence is determined at least partially by its intention, the sense we give to it, the concepts associated with it, and its extension, the group of things in the world the word or sentence refer to. Okay. And so we see here, ceci n'est pas un pipe. This is not a pipe. This is a representation of a pipe. And really, this is a representation of a famous painting by Magritte. This, graciously and wonderfully, drawn by my wonderful fiancée. This is a representation of Magritte's famous painting, which was a representation of a pipe, with the caption, ceci n'est pas un pipe. This is not a pipe. Why would he say, here's a painting of a pipe, and this is not a pipe? Well, because it's not a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. This is a representation of Magritte's representation of a pipe. What you're looking at is a video representation of this representation of Magritte's representation of a pipe. But even further, to understand this, you have something in you, mentally, physically, that represents the video representation, of the blackboard representation, of Magritte's representation of a pipe. And the question we have is about the nature of that thing in you that represents. Okay. Now there's a number of issues that attend this. I'm assuming not all of you knew about Magritte's painting. And so you might have known that that right there was a representation of a pipe. But you may not have known that that was a representation of Magritte's representation of a pipe. I told you that, and now you recognize that this is a representation of Magritte's representation of a pipe. But something happened there that allowed you to understand this as a representation of Magritte's representation in a way that you did not previously understand. Something happened there. I'll get to this. Well, okay, I'll get it now. So before I talked about CAPTCHAs, these sort of codes that are attended with noise that are to test whether or not you're human. Humans can solve this frame problem by picking out the parts of a representation that are relevant and ignoring parts that are not. You can frame the situation correctly. You can tell what parts of a picture are about something and what parts are not. So one of the questions about representation is whether or not a picture in and of itself represents a world or something in the world, or whether or not it's our interpretation of that picture, complete with us ignoring noise, that allows us to say the picture is about something. You could have looked at this and thought that this was just scribbles and not about anything. But because you have certain knowledge about, say, pipes, what pipes look like, how pictures work, etc., likely you saw that and immediately thought that that is a wonderfully drawn pipe. There's an issue. One is the issue of the frame problem, how we separate noise from the relevant parts of a representation. There's also the issue of theory latentness. That is, we don't just see, so theory latentness goes, we don't just see a thing as it is, but rather we interpret anything we see in terms of the background knowledge we have. And so one example of this that's given is a cathode ray tube. Maybe this is a bit antedated, but cathode ray tube in a lab with an expert astronomer who uses cathode ray tubes, goes in there and sees a cathode ray tube. The freshman who's never dealt with cathode ray tubes before goes into the lab and sees a glass globe with certain squiggles inside, does not see a cathode ray tube. Later, this student gains certain knowledge about the role of cathode ray tubes, what they are, the role they play in astronomy, the equipment, and then walks into the lab and then sees a cathode ray tube as opposed to a bit of glass with curls inside. And so this would be to say that what we see is at least partially dependent on the theory we have in hand. And then it can be claimed very drastic things that the expert and the novice in a given field just live in different worlds because they experience things differently because they have a different background theory. That's all going to be important. But now the question is, well, what is representation? The idea is that our mental processes, our thoughts that are propositional, right, our propositional attitudes are intentional. They're about something in the world. And now we want to determine what it is that makes them about something in the world. There's some representation had mentally that attends to, directs us towards something in the world. The representation somehow, by way of a bit of resemblance, is about the thing in the world. And now, whatever this medium of representation is, we get debates on particularly whether it's internal or external, entirely internal or partially external. The thing, the bit of content that represents something in the world, that is about something in the world. Internalists say that that representation, all of the content of that representation is entirely internal to us. Externalists say, no, at least partially, it is external to us. It depends on the environment, the context of the environment, etc. So if I have a hallucination of a pipe versus seeing a pipe, or a mediated version of a pipe by way of a picture, are there differences in these three cases? The representation I have mentally, is it the same in the two cases, or does the actual presence of the pipe change that representation? And if so, does this mean that the representation is partially dependent on something external to us? There's debate on where to draw the line between what counts as internal and what counts as external. And so you could get people admitting that the same sort of processes play into yielding meaning to representations, and yet get a disagreement on whether that means it's internal or external, the origin of that meaning had by the representation. That's okay. There's some muddiness, but we can understand the difference between internalism and externalism. Two different debates. Where do we draw the line between internal and external? And then, given that we've drawn that line, is the meaning of a mental representation determined internally or externally? Okay? And so the first reading from, well, actually I didn't have you read this. Fodor, I didn't have you read this because Fodor's difficult, for me at least. I don't particularly like the way Fodor writes. But he gives us this language of thought. He says that there is a language that all thought occurs in. Sometimes he's pushed to make very strong claims that this is sort of language independent, depending on what natural language you and I have. We have the same internal language of thought. And even other thinking things like the dogs may have the same language of thought. The language of thought, well, first we have to talk about language. Language is built up of syntax and semantics, and the meaning of a language, a sentence, a word, is determined by syntax, semantics, and pragmatic considerations. The syntax is just the rules of structure, how words go together. Do propositions go before or after a word? You can have different syntaxes in different natural languages. Semantics is the meaning of the terms or the meaning of the sentences, and this will at least partially be related to syntax. Change the order of the words, you've changed the meaning of the sentence. But also, oftentimes, when we're interpreting the meaning of other people, we're making an appeal to things outside of syntax and semantics. Context considerations. If I say, it is 6 o'clock, you understand what I mean, but what I mean is not contained in the sentence, it is 6 o'clock. Part of the meaning of a sentence is its truth conditions, the conditions under which it's true and false. But depending on when and where I emit the sentence, it is 6 o'clock, the meaning of that sentence changes because its truth value changes. If I mean, it is 6 o'clock in the Eastern time zone, according to a certain measurement of time, and so on, then maybe it's true. If I mean something else, maybe it's false. All of this that's going into determining whether what I say is true or false, this is a pragmatic consideration. Determining the reference of pronouns is a pragmatic consideration. If I say, she is coming home soon, the referent, the thing in the world that is referred to by the word she, is not picked out by that sentence. If there were other sentences before it, you might understand what the she refers to. But that's not contained in the meaning of the words. It's not contained in the syntax of the sentence. It's contained in other things. Those are pragmatic considerations. So then we have the question of, well, the thing in our head has a meaning. It represents something in the world. And then what are the syntactical, semantic, and possibly pragmatic parts of that meaning? Okay. Fodor says the language of thought is purely syntactical. It's a language built up only of laws of the symbols, what symbols are valid and invalid, and how the symbols relate to one another. And then from that, he claims that syntax can determine semantics, the meaning of the symbols and the meaning of the combination of the symbols. So all I have in me mentally, and then presumably something underlying that physically, is some symbol and combinations of symbols, rules for good and bad combinations of symbols, and that is sufficient for determining the meaning of the representation made up of those symbols. It's debatable, and there's been lots of debate, both in philosophy of mind, epistemology, philosophy of language, and so forth, whether syntax really can fully determine semantics or not. If we have a syntax in our head, a way of giving rules, a set of symbols with rules, and that is sufficient for determining semantics, the meaning of the representations, then it seems that internalism is possible. One concern here is that it's said that a picture, if I just give you a picture, it's not about clearly one thing more so than another thing, right? If I give you a picture of a pipe, is it about a smoking instrument? Is it about a certain series of shapes? Is it about a color? Is it about pictures attended with words and so forth? That information is not contained in the picture itself. That's a claim that semantics is not determined entirely by syntax. Fodor takes the hard line that semantics is entirely determined by syntax. Okay? And now as far as the theory of the language of thought goes, he says, well, we have a belief that P, this is a propositional belief, it's about something in the world. For any belief we have, propositional attitude we have, intentional belief we have, there exists some mental symbols that represent that thought. And then he says, look, the canonical example of this is computers. Computers are just a syntactical system, And this syntactical system can do all kinds of incredible things, including things that have meaning. They can represent things. Possibly. But if this is true, what's the issue with the CAPTCHA? Why can computers not solve the frame problem? The frame problem seems to be a way of, it's an issue of determining what is meaningful in a picture. If computers are a syntactic system and syntax determines semantics, then why can't computers solve the frame problem? Well, one way out here is to say, well, they're not an exhaustive syntactic system. We haven't perfected the syntactical system. Something of that sort. But then there's the question of, well, how does the meaning of a given symbol, set of symbols, combination of symbols, how does the meaning, the semantics, get attached to the syntax? It seems that in computers, even if we grant that they have a syntax and that syntax can be meaningful, it can represent things. Well, but it seems that the reason that that's possible is because there were programmers, right? The meaning did not arise through the computer syntactical processes without meaning already attached to the syntax. There was meaning attached to the syntax. The meaning was attached to the syntax by something external to the computer system, namely the programmer. And so this is sort of an internalist-externalist question. Even if syntax of computers is sufficient for delivering meaning, semantics, representation, did that come only from the syntax, or did it come from the syntax plus something that already understood meaning, a programmer? And then, by analogy, is the case similar for humans? And so, Fodor has a catchphrase. He says, well, there's no intentional causation without explicit representation. Intentional causation, I have a thought that's about a pain in my foot that causes me to reach for my foot or pull away my foot. That's intentional causation. A thought about something caused something else. Caused another thought. I'm hungry. That makes me think about peanut butter and jelly. I'm itchy. That makes me think about scratching. It also causes me to reach for my foot. It causes me to walk to the refrigerator, get out peanut butter, and so forth. He says there is no such case of intentional causation without explicit representation. Some representation in the language of thought that is explicit, not implicit to be interpreted by something else. And so there's the case of, well, get your queen out early. Then it says, well, he was talking to a computer programmer that programs a chess computer, and the programmer said that there's a problem with this other programmer's chess computer because that chess computer operates on the assumption that the computer ought to get the queen out early. But it could be the case that that is never explicitly represented in the system, but rather emerges through other rules that are explicitly represented. But at some point we have to get to rules that are explicitly represented. Now this does not say that every explicit representation leads to intentional causation. It says that every instance of intentional causation has an explicit representation. It also doesn't say anything about whether this representation is entirely internal or external. It does say explicit, but that's vague in the context, right? And so Dennett comes in, says lots of things, but one thing he says, and this goes back to the progress in philosophy of mind, the way we put one theory in place of another, Dennett says, Fodor makes a very strong case. He says that maybe you think there are problems with this claim that syntax determines semantics, but this is the only way language of thought can work. And psychology, in its entirety, is committed to a theory that turns on, whether it's explicitly known by psychologists or not. Dennett says that Fodor says all psychology depends on folk psychology, which depends on representation, which depends on the language of thought. So, if there are counterintuitive implications of the language of thought, so be it. You have a trade-off here. Accept those counterintuitive implications of the language of thought, or deny them and take away what is needed for folk psychology, which in turn takes away what is needed for psychology. If Fodor's theory collapses, all of psychology collapses. So says Dennett, says Fodor. That's a very strong, explicit, theoretical, scientific claim. There may be problems, counterintuitive reasons, implications of this theory that might lead us to think we need a different theory, but this theory needs to be accepted for a certain science, and therefore we ought to accept counterintuitive implications and try and work them out rather than seek a different theory and then replace all of psychology with something else. Dennett is skeptical of this internalism, and he says, well, look, at some point, if I said to you that, did you know that zebras don't wear trench coats in the wild, you would say, yes, I know this, but until you read it in Dennett or until I just said it, you probably never thought that before in your life. But at some point, you must have gained that knowledge. You were not born with knowledge of zebras, let alone knowledge of trench coats, and zebras not wearing trench coats in the wild. So at some point you acquired that knowledge. Where did that knowledge come from? For internalism to be true, it had to come only from what was already in us, the syntax, relationship between properties, somehow built up, and we got that. If it came from influence of the external environment, then it seems that there's something external to us that helped us get that meaning, the thing that represented zebras don't wear trench coats in the wild. That representation had meaning. That's how we recognize that, hey, when someone says, did you know zebras don't wear trench coats in the wild? You say, yeah, I knew that. You were able to do that because you had a representation of that fact. And that representation took on meaning by influence of the environment. And if we draw the line between internalism and externalism at that point, influence of the environment, then it seems that internalism is false. One of the points Dennett makes. Putnam's reading, complicated, very famous, been used in lots of different areas, epistemology, language, philosophy of mind. But his concern is over the issue of sense and reference, or over the issue of intentionality and extensionality. If you remember, I talked about the case of the morning star, the evening star, and Venus. These three terms all pick out, they all refer to the same thing, Venus, the planet that we call Venus. They have the same extension. But the morning star has different concepts associated with it. The evening star has different concepts associated with it. And so they have different senses. And they have different senses from one another. You could have knowledge about the morning star and fail to know that that is also knowledge about the evening star. Right? And this is one move we made to say, well, look, this is why qualitative properties of mental experiences are not a counterexample to a physical underlying realization of the mental experience. The mental is still identical to the physical, despite this property, because it's not a property of the thing itself, but rather a property of us and the way we attend to that physical property. We can go about knowing things in different ways. That intentional property of pain, that it has a certain thing about it, a certain way we experience it, is not about the thing, it's about the way we know the thing. And so qualitative properties are supposed to not be a counterexample to a reduction of the mental to the physical, because they're not actually properties of the physical at all, but rather a property of us in relation to the physical. And here we have talk, well, so the referent of the morning star, the referent of the evening star is the same thing. It picks out the same thing in the world, but we have different concepts associated with them. Okay? And so he says, well, look, it's generally taken that intention, the concepts we have, determine intention. If you and I share the same concepts, we're picking out the same thing in the world. Right? Even if you and I have different terms for something. Ceci n'est pas un pipe. This is not a pipe. Different languages, but if they're connected the same way with other concepts being propositional and not connected to an explicit representation in a given language, if the concepts are the same, if their functional relations are the same, then when you have the concept un pipe and I have the concept a pipe, we're referring to the same thing in the world. Even if in France, pipes are associated with a certain kind of culture, and in America they're not. Okay, but the same sort of functional roles were going on for the most part. Some variation is fine. If you and I have the exact same concept, we're picking out the same thing in the world. He's going to challenge this. Now, the other thing doesn't go, right? Picking out the same thing in the world does not mean we have the same concepts. Extension does not determine intention. The person who knew about the morning star but not the evening star, and the person that knew about the evening star but not the morning star, they were referring to the same thing, but that did not make them have the same concepts. They had different concepts. So extension not generally taken to determine intention, but intention is generally taken to determine extension, and he wants to challenge this. That's part of what the H2O example is doing. He says, well, look, if you look at the doppelgangers in the Earth and the Earth-2 twin Earth case, they are identical. They have the same concepts, but because water is different things in the two different worlds, H2O and XYZ, they're not referring to the same thing. They have the same concepts, but they do not refer to the same thing, and therefore intention does not determine extension. The thing in my head, the concept does not determine the meaning, because meaning partially depends on the referent. Same exact meaning, intentions, same senses, same concepts given to the word water here and on twin Earth, but a different referent, which means the word water means different things in the two different Earths. And here what we're doing, we're talking about language, because language is a clear representation system. We have words, beep, pipe, water, that refer to something in the world, have concepts associated with them. Words represent things, and so these words are supposed to be a proxy, an analog to whatever the symbol system in our head is. Okay? And so if it's true for words that the concepts associated with the words, the sense, the thing in our head, does not exhaust or determine referent, it does not determine meaning because of that, and therefore the referent is partially determined by what is in the world, whether it's XYZ or H2O, and therefore the meaning is partially determined by what's in the world, and therefore internalism is false. And so the final reading sort of brings this home, but only if you recognize that we're talking about language, because language is made of words and words are representations. Everyone believes this, whether they believe that words have meaning or not. There's a debate over this, whether the meaning of a sentence is determined by the words in that sentence and the way they're combined, or whether the meaning of the words is determined by the sentence. Nonetheless, language is taken to be representational. It has meaning, it's about things in the world. And now the question is, well, taking that as an analog for whatever's in our head or whatever's in our mind, there's something in our mind that represents things in the world. There's something in our brain that represents things in the world. Now, if we can be precise about what's required of this representational system in order for it to have this meaning, then we can be precise about what an intentional property is, and we can determine whether or not it could be realized by, say, neurons. Neurons and neuronal processes, firing potentials, etc. If that could be the syntactical system, the symbols that are changed according to certain rules, firing potentials, etc., and from that we can get meaning, then neurons by themselves could represent and mean things about the world. If they can do that, but only with input from the environment, either historically, developmentally, through learning how certain neurons should take on certain meanings, associations, then externalism is the case. If they can do it without that input from the world, say purely through logic, just letting these symbols interact with each other in a true, false, they can still update each other, modify each other, change firing potentials. If they could do that without input from the world and still have meaning, then internalism is true. And we have to be careful here. This is like the a priori, a posteriori case. A priori knowledge is knowledge you could have prior to experience. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge you could only have after experience. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is generally taken to be a bit of a priori knowledge, even though likely every single one of us were taught that at some point. And so we did actually gain that knowledge through input from the external world, through experience. We could have, it is said, gained that knowledge without input from the external world, without experience. Internalism is this sort of case. Even if the meaning associated to my neuronal firings or the symbol system in my mind is gained through experience from the external world, could it have gained meaning? Not specifically the meaning it does have, but any meaning without input from the external world. If so, internalism could maintain truth. Externalism says no, it has to have input from the external world, either developmentally or immediately. If I see a pipe, and I have a thought of a pipe, a thought that's about a pipe, something in my head, something in my mind that represents a pipe, did seeing the pipe affect that representation? If so, there's input from the external world right here, right now. And that's the debate over internalism and externalism. Is there a role played by the external world in determining the meaning of my representational system?